fluorescent lights hummed over the county hearing room as a state agricultural official read through the eminent domain filing, barely glancing up at the man seated alone at the defendant's table. The reservoir project requires acquisition of the Webb property in its entirety. Construction timeline requires resolution within 90 days. Marcus Webb, 41 years old, raised his hand. Before you finalize this, I need it on record that this seizure conflicts with existing federal protections on this land. The official, a woman named Patricia Vance, offered a thin smile. Mr. Webb, we've reviewed the property extensively. I'd encourage you to focus your energy on relocation planning instead. Marcus said nothing further. He simply gathered his folder and left. And by harvest day, that same dismissive smile would be gone completely. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from tonight? 500 acres outside Cedar Bend, Missouri, had supported the Webb family for 3 generations, corn and soybeans mostly, enough to raise Marcus's 2 children, Ellie and Sam, comfortably, even after his wife Denise passed away from cancer 4 years earlier. Single parenthood reshaped Marcus's days entirely, farming during school hours, homework help in the evenings, and increasingly, research conducted late at night once the kids were finally asleep. Announcement of the regional reservoir project came 18 months earlier, state officials explaining the need for expanded water storage capacity to serve a growing metropolitan area 2 counties over. The property, situated in a low-lying valley ideal for water retention, sat directly at the center of the proposed reservoir footprint, along with portions of 3 neighboring farms whose owners had already accepted buyout offers rather than fight a project backed by state infrastructure funding. Patricia Vance's office had approached Marcus 8 months earlier with what she called a generous relocation package, expecting the same quick acceptance she'd received from his neighbors. Something his grandfather had mentioned decades earlier surfaced in Marcus's memory instead. Back when Marcus was still a boy trailing behind him through the fields, his grandfather always referred to a low, marshy section along the property's eastern edge simply as the protected ground, never fully explaining what that meant. Denise's illness and passing had consumed Marcus's attention for years before the reservoir announcement, leaving little energy for anything beyond raising his children and keeping the farm running. His grandfather's old phrase, though, kept surfacing once state surveyors began marking boundaries near that same marshy eastern section, prompting Marcus to finally dig into county and federal records he'd never previously had reason to examine. Late nights at the kitchen table became routine, Ellie and Sam long asleep upstairs, Marcus working through environmental survey records, wetland classification maps, and Federal Conservation Program archives dating back decades. What he found, buried in a 1987 Conservation Reserve Program filing his grandfather had enrolled the eastern acreage in, suggested something state officials apparently hadn't discovered during their property assessment. Not simply unproductive farmland, as the state survey had assumed, the marshy section qualified as a federally protected wetland under conservation easement terms his grandfather had established decades earlier, terms that, if still legally active, would make the state's proposed reservoir footprint illegal. Without a lengthy federal review process nobody involved in the project had apparently anticipated. Confirming whether that decades-old easement remained legally binding became Marcus's focus over the following months, even as Patricia Vance's office moved forward with formal eminent domain proceedings, treating his occasional questions about the eastern acreage as minor delays rather than genuine legal obstacles. Survey crews continued marking construction boundaries through the following weeks, state officials scheduling the reservoir's groundbreaking with the confidence of a project facing no remaining obstacles. Patricia Vance's office sent a final relocation offer, treating Marcus's earlier objection at the hearing as little more than an emotional outburst rather than a substantive legal claim. If you've made it this far, you already sense Marcus found something real. And if you want to see exactly what turns this seizure around, hit subscribe now. Because we're getting close to harvest day and everything it reveals. Marcus's research led him to Diane Okonkwo, an environmental attorney specializing in federal conservation easements, after a chance conversation with a county extension office worker who recognized the significance of what Marcus described. Diane reviewed the 1987 filing carefully, cross-referencing it against current federal wetland protection databases. Mr. Webb, Diane said during their first meeting, spreading photocopied records across her desk. This easement your grandfather established is still active. It was never formally terminated, and under federal law, that means this section of your property carries permanent conservation protections that supersede state eminent domain authority. Relief, mixed with disbelief, settling over him differently than anything had in months. Marcus asked, "Does that stop the whole reservoir project?" "It doesn't stop the project entirely," Diane said carefully, "but it means the state cannot legally include this protected section in their reservoir footprint without initiating a formal federal review process, one that could take years and likely require an entirely redesigned project boundary. I don't think Patricia Vance's office ran this property through federal wetland databases before initiating seizure. That's a significant oversight." Harvest Day arrived in late September, coinciding with a state-mandated deadline for finalizing eminent domain documentation. Diane accompanied Marcus to a formal meeting with Patricia Vance's legal team, arriving with documentation of the active 1987 conservation easement, alongside confirmation from the Federal Wetland Protection Registry. "Miss Vance," Diane began, sliding copies of the easement filing across the conference table, "your project's current footprint includes approximately 80 acres of federally protected wetland, established under a conservation easement that has remained continuously active since 1987. This designation was apparently never identified during your property assessment process." Patricia's expression shifted from practiced confidence to visible concern as she reviewed the documents. "Our environmental team conducted a full survey of this property." "Then your environmental team missed this filing," Diane continued, unbothered. "It exists in both county records and the Federal Wetland Conservation Database. Under federal law, eminent domain proceedings cannot proceed against protected wetland acreage without a formal review process through the appropriate federal agency, a process that typically requires 12 to 18 months minimum and could result in permanent exclusion of this acreage from your project entirely." State attorneys exchanged glances that suggested rapid, unwelcome recalculation. "What exactly does this mean for our construction timeline?" Patricia finally asked. "It means," Diane said, "your reservoir footprint, as currently designed, cannot legally proceed. You'll need to either redesign the project boundary to exclude this protected acreage or initiate federal review, which, given the strength of this easement's documentation, is unlikely to result in approval to proceed regardless." Nobody at the table spoke for a long moment as the state's legal team absorbed the scope of their oversight. Marcus, who'd spent 8 months being treated as an obstacle rather than a legitimate concern, watched Patricia Vance's earlier dismissiveness collapse into something closer to genuine alarm about her department's exposure. "This changes our entire project timeline," Patricia finally admitted. "We'll need to bring this to our engineering team immediately." Formal notification arrived 6 weeks later, confirming what Diane had predicted. State officials redesigned the reservoir project entirely, shifting the footprint to exclude Marcus's property along with the protected wetland acreage that had complicated their original plans. The eminent domain filing against the Webb farm was formally withdrawn. Scrutiny over the state's inadequate environmental review process followed quickly, with regional media picking up the story of a single father whose grandfather's decades-old conservation decision ultimately protected the family farm from government seizure. 2 other property owners along the original reservoir footprint, whose land also bordered protected wetland sections nobody had properly identified, successfully challenged their own seizure proceedings using the precedent Marcus's case established. "Grandpa really saved the farm without even knowing he was doing it?" Ellie asked over dinner one evening. old enough now to understand what her father's late-night research had actually accomplished. Marcus thought about it, remembering his grandfather's old phrase about the protected ground that he'd never fully explained. "I think he understood something important about taking care of land for the future," Marcus told his children. Even if none of us fully knew why until it mattered most. Stability returned to the Webb farm over the following months, harvest concluding successfully on land that had nearly been seized just weeks earlier. Diane's office reported that Patricia Vance's department implemented considerably more thorough environmental review procedures for future infrastructure projects, a change directly attributed to the oversight Marcus's case had exposed. Sometimes the quietest warnings turn out to be the truest ones. Marcus's grandfather protected this land decades before anyone understood why, and it saved everything for his grandchildren. If stories like this move you, subscribe, because there's more coming every week.